नमस्कार साथियों, मैं डॉक्टर लोकेश भाटिया स्वागत करता हूं आपका लोक टॉक्स चैनल पर। सिगमंड फ्रूड, the way he defined ego. Let's understand something about what is ego and what is false ego. Our life is in duality always. So the one of the level of our survival of our existence is ego is one of the 7 levels of our existence. Human ego or a wounded ego. Human hardwiring is in such a manner. We need to understand that we are divine and human. The divine nature is by many other names: the holy self, the spiritual core. The unhealthy wounded ego is known as false self. In Eastern philosophy, it is said yin and yang, the true self versus false self. And this duality is inbuilt in human nature. Finite self and infinite self, or the higher self and the lower self. Excessive egotism or self-regards that people often have for themselves. Everyone is made up of pair of opposites which are complementary to each other. Arrogance and humility, generosity and greed, peacefulness and violence, and there is always a seesaw mechanism of these two opposites. However, to live gracefully and to achieve one's goals is to nurture accurate sense of self and one's abilities. So now let's understand certain basic differences and why it is called a level of existence. The higher ego or the real ego is not at all the dark force, but the false ego is one of the dark forces. And that is the only which can get wounded. The real self or the higher self can never get wounded. Without a real ego, our existence or our survival is not possible. Because of that real ego, we are able to distinguish ourselves with others. For example, my name is Lokesh, right? So that is the name which I have acquired after my birth. So since my birth, what all things, including my name to what all I have acquired in my life, that is real ego. And to all those real things what you have acquired by your own efforts or gifted by your parents, gifted by the society, is the real ego. And mind well, again I'm telling you, that's a divine ego that you have got it and no one ever can wound it ever. Now, if we see about the false ego, if the ego gets wounded, it means it has lost its divine nature. And it's no more beneficial. The real ego will always be a beneficial human experience, and the false ego will always be a harmful experience to a human life. Let's understand these things, and later I'm going to explain you why am I talking about all these things today. Something very importantly I'll be concluding, where you will really feel that you have definitely been benefited by today's talk. So be with me till the last of this talk today. It's very important talk today. So the real ego will always help you to identify yourself, who you are, to distinguish yourself, to make your distinction in this society. And it safeguards and protects our identity. It helps us to distinguish what is me and what is not me. The real ego is our healthy ego, and we have a sense of well-being because of the real ego. Just keep on thinking the opposites of all these what I am talking about. But as long as you have understood first the real ego, then only we will be able to make out the opposites of it. In its healthiest state, ego will make you more healthier, a healthy, thoughtful person, where you will always be thinking of not only your good self, but good for others, good for the society, good for the country, good for the humanity. And you will never think of damaging ever, even in your thoughts, to not only to yourself, to anybody in this world ever. That means the healthy ego helps you to set the boundaries, what and how I should be leading my life. So that means the real ego governs our life and all the affairs around our life. Real ego is responsible for maintaining the sense of self and protection and maintenance of that sense of self. We continue to live and thrive. It recharges us and survival becomes comfortable. And need for unique self-expression. So, real ego is a real need for your self-expression. So, this is what is divine self. On the contrary, the wounded ego or the false ego, we know many examples. All right. When I'll tell you examples, you will be able to correlate it very well. But let's understand what is meant by when all this, our real ego or the divine ego or the real self, when that gets wounded, means the divinity is lost, So that is where the birth of the wounded ego starts, or the birth of the unhealthy self begins. And at some point, the healthy ego, when gets damaged, wounded, the split of its divinity is taking place. Ego can no longer be properly used. Instead of being beneficial to one's own self and to the society, you start getting thoughts which are not only damaging yourself, will start damaging others as well. So it is detrimental. The wounded ego is detrimental for your own progress. And when ego becomes distorted, no longer recognizable, what is it? Maintaining force, and that leads to our demolition. Now let's understand something about what I said just now, the birth of a wounded ego. When your ego gets shattered, how one starts behaving, something happens which makes us to feel less than others. Something threatens our existence, beats it, breaks it, ignores, or feeling of abandonment. The healthy ego begins to separate, and the separation of the whole self, not only the separation of one own self, the separation of whole self becomes a strong damaging force to be reckoned with this. And here the birth of wounded ego takes place. Insecurities, mistakes, deep mental wounds discover the ugly truths. The healthy ego drives you to excel, whereas the wounded ego destroys not only to your own self, the wounded ego will destroy others to such an extent that you can go to worst of the scenarios. Very soon I am going to show you a video and you will be able to make out what am I talking about. How the ego leads to anger, lust. These are all going to spoil your own life. Unless you are peaceful, unless you realize what is happening, what is healthy and unhealthy ego, you will not be able to make a difference. So, a healthy ego will always bring in a sense of competition. And as you go higher and higher, as you are able to label yourself more higher and higher, a time comes when you are feeling that you are still not that smart enough, because you always find somebody ahead of you. And it is definitely going to happen. Somebody is always going to be ahead of you in life. And that sense of competition will make you to go more up and up, that pushing yourself up, there is nothing wrong in it. But feeling less than others, this is where you are wounding yourself, and that when you wound yourself, when you start feeling less than others, that is where your real ego or the divine self gets lost. You begin to make different choices. Shame and lot of times start feeling depressed. Maybe you feel not to socialize with people who you don't think good about, or you may think that the other people are not thinking good about you. And this is where you start damaging and wounding your own healthy ego, and the birth of a false self gets a birth within. A wounded ego, if you are projecting somebody else's idea as your own, soon you are heading to a time that you will land up in a serious conflict. Because originally, if that idea was not yours, then you are not able to think for very long on that idea, and a time comes when your healthy self gets into an unhealthy self and you become locked out. You feel surrounded by hostile situations. Your fear of within gets trapped, and that is where you quickly find excuses, and that is where you try to over defend yourself. Instead of trying to boost yourself, you try to over defend yourself, and which is quite obvious for people. It is not something which people are not able to make out. Definitely people are able to make out that is it your healthy self or the divine self or your wounded self which is making you to behave like this. Well, when healthy ego senses a bit of danger, it automatically searches for distractions, and working diligently to protect its territory unknowingly. You start listening to your voice of wounded ego, and you can't trust anyone. There is nobody there for me. You can't focus on what is wrong, what's missing. So this is what kind of feelings and thoughts start getting developed within you because of your wounded ego. As a reality, the wounded ego becomes one's self-focused. The one will talk only about me and myself. The wounded ego has many mechanisms to ensure its victory. Unhealthy ego, main defense, and ultimately its downfall is its arrogance. Arrogance is the best defense of unhealthy ego. Arrogance means you are not willing to accept anybody else's thoughts. You cannot sit, you cannot join any meeting. Whatever you think that is only right. You cannot accept others' suggestions. You cannot accept others' thoughts. Howsoever good, better or best it may be, you become so arrogant of your own thought process that you think that whatever you are thinking, that is the only correct thing. Rest all are wrong. You are the only one who is correct. So that's how a wounded ego will always behave. The wounded ego will always try to prove one own point and that he or she is only correct, rest all others are fooling themselves by trying to suggest him or her. So, if you find anyone around you who is behaving like this, one should never ever try to correct them.
It is basically their own job to figure out what's wrong with them, because gradually they will have to realize. And another worst situation is these kind of wounded egoistic people will hurt others' ego also. They will make others also angry. So try and identify such people and never get angry, because one has to handle every one negative emotion with a positive emotion only. The anger can only be addressed by love. There is no better manner than addressing negative emotions. If anybody is misbehaving, do not start replying the misbehavior with another misbehavior, because that is always possible to happen, and people have landed up in serious disastrous situations too. I'll be sharing in my next video what kind of serious situations I am talking about. Stay connected. Watch the part 2 of this video. Thank you.